Good evening all and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be going home. But be careful. Someone might be trying to break in. Before the video begins, I'd just like to say that on my coffee I am posting some interesting stuff. Some interviews with my wife about funny and random questions that we answer every week. So if you want to get to know the real Mort and this interests you, I'm going to give you a little clip right now. But you can find a link in the description.
So, if you were a transformer, what vehicle would you turn into?
Right, not something I get asked every day, or ever. Probably a lorry.
What kind of lorry?
Oh, a lorry?
What, like Hovis bread type lorry, like
Exactly, inconspicuous.
like any type of
People
lorry,
always see lorries on the road. You know,
a large lorry or a small lorry?
large lorry.
Red lorry, yellow lorry.
Exactly. Maybe both.
Say it fast. Challenge.
Red lorry, yellow, red lorry, yellow.
Red lorry, yellow lorry. Red lorry, yellow lorry.
I can't. Yeah, you missed out for the last one.
Oh, I was only doing it that time.
Okay.
Right. Okay, next question. What would your strategy for... Let me start that again.
Okay.
What would your strategy be for a zombie
For a zombie what?
apocalypse?
Apocalypse. Right.
Sorry, what would your strategy be for a zombie apocalypse?
Well, that's it. So, I hope you liked it, but for now, it's time to get comfortable. Lock your doors, and let the darkness take control. When I was 6, and my brother 8, we had a room in a town home that shared a wall. Creepy things would happen in that room, mainly due to our imagination. We once had a friend who was a black widow spider that would come out at night and hang out in the corner by the door. We would talk to it and make up stories about what it did during the day. Anyway, one night we were trying to get to sleep, but kept hearing pounding on the wall. We let it happen for a while before we screamed for our mum. She was disheveled at the time and came into the room and said, "What?" We explained to her that there was repeated banging against the wall, but when she came into that room it stopped. She said it was just the wind. Keep in mind this was a very likely explanation due to the fact that it was monsoon season in Arizona. She said she would come in and check on us in a bit. That evening was difficult for her. She was breaking up with her boyfriend due to his drug abuse issues, so dealing with creepy sounds was not on the top of her priorities list. Not 5 minutes after, the banging continued, this time louder, and somehow closer. I screamed again, and ran out into the living room. My mum was standing in a very defensive posture with tears streaming down her face, and her boyfriend looked very angry. He grunted and immediately left. When outside and in his car, he held down on the horn of his car for a good minute before finally leaving. I guess it was his rage quit. She was so relieved when he left and made sure to lock the door and the bolt and the chain. She brought me back to our room, where my brother said that the sound stopped once I screamed and left the room. My mum sat in the room with us and talked to us until we fell asleep. There was no more banging that night, and in the morning my mum woke up early and sat us down in the living room. This was something that had never happened. She didn't mention the breakup with her boyfriend. There was something else more pressing. Our doorknob was busted and unlocked, and someone had scraped at our bolt lock. There were half a dozen police outside. She explained to us that the neighbors had been broken into, and they had tried to get into our house as well. Luckily for us, our additional security measures, i.e. the bolt lock and chain, meant they couldn't get in. She brought us over to talk with the neighbor. We played with the kids next door a lot, and they happened to be staying at their grandma's that night for a sleepover. We walked around their house to see that everything was gone. Everything. Even their food had been stripped from the cabinets. One thing that became very apparent during the tour of this house, they were avoiding their living room. There were many police officers there and interviewing the mum. When we finally got to the living room, we find out why. The wall of their living room was connected to our bedroom. There was an indent in the wall about 6 feet in diameter and about a foot deep. Turns out the robbers were trying to break into our house through our shared wall. They broke into 3 other houses that night via the front door, but none of the others had bolt locks. Somehow the robbers thought it would be easier to chisel through the wall than to go through the bolt lock. What they weren't prepared for was the fact that our particular unit was added after the others. The shared wall was actually a solid brick exterior wall, unlike the others in the complex. They had spent hours trying to get through when they could have just easily busted down the door. After that day, my mum never told us again the noise was just the wind. Again. I'm a 27-year-old female. I'm recently moved into a nice apartment in a safe neighborhood with my 2 dogs, Charles and Wigwam. Charles is a Corgi German Shepherd mix and is the most loving, but overly obnoxious, while Wigwam is a Lhasa Apso, who is quiet, sweet, and most definitely scared of his own shadow. I've only been in my new place for about a month after this experience. I highly doubt I'm going to make it here for the duration of my long lease. The way these apartments are set up is that each floor has its own set of doors that lead to 4 apartments and a fire escape door that only appears from the inside. I'm on the back side of the building, which places my patio about 10-ish feet from the fire escape stairs. I take my dogs out 3 times a day, midnight being the latest I'll go out by myself, and every time I leave my apartment, I put the bar lock on my patio door and lock my front door without fail. About a week ago, we had a snowstorm, and I had cracked my patio door because I love cold weather and I'm an adult and want to watch the snow fall. It was around 11 p.m, and I decided that since it was getting late I should take the dogs out for the night, since they both hate the snow. This would be a quick trip. I go to lock the patio door and decide against it because I'm on the freaking 5th floor and I'm only going to be outside for a few minutes. I get the dogs ready, grab my keys and lock my door as I leave the apartment. I go down to the designated pet area with my beloved dogs and let them do their thing. Then back to the apartment we go, safely. Or so I thought. This is where I thought I was losing my mind. But in actuality, it was about to go down. As soon as we walked into the apartment, my dogs run over to the patio door, and I notice the door is shut and the bar is locked. I immediately think that's strange, but didn't connect the dots, so I go to the kitchen to get the dog treats, and both dogs start going crazy, growling at a large cedar chest in the living room. And as I'm walking to see what the commotion is about, I see a pair of eyes creeping from under the chest lid. I stood there for about 5 seconds before I realized what I was seeing, and calmly walked backwards to the front door, opened it, and told my dogs I was letting them go outside. They ran out without leashes, and I immediately get them, and myself, into the car, locked the doors and called the police. They showed up in less than 5 minutes, go up to my apartment, and after about 22 officers are dragging a 40-ish-year-old guy in handcuffs, and then the plot thickens. This dude had been watching me since I moved in, and had been staking out my place waiting for an opportunity to get inside because he knew I lived alone. If that's not creepy enough already, he had a fanny pack, since it's still the 90s, and he had a pocket knife, needles, ketamine, and a picture of me from the day I moved in. And his plan was to sneak in through my patio door, wait for me to fall asleep, and, well, you can imagine the rest. Needless to say, I didn't sleep for days because I thought he would come back. Luckily, he's still in jail. But I will never forget those eyes. When I was about 14, my parents left me alone overnight for the first time. I grew up in a small farming community, so my parents really had nothing to worry about. They left, and I decided to take an awesome bubble bath and paint my nails like all girls everywhere, obviously. While I was in the bath, I heard our back door open. I thought I was hearing things, and besides, I had locked all the doors per my mum's orders. But then, I heard the kitchen floor squeaky spot. I didn't know what to do, so just went under the bubbles and left my head out. I saw 2 shoes through the crack between the door and floor, and I could hear a person breathing. They stood there for about 30 seconds and walked away. I heard the door slam, but I didn't move. I stayed there until the water was freezing and cried. Then I got out, called my grandma, and checked the doors. The back door was unlocked, and the lock hadn't been messed with or broken. Later that week, we learnt a man was breaking into farmhouses. This happened to my sister about 15 years ago, when she was in high school and I was in middle school. Our mum worked as a house cleaner and always became good friends with everyone whose home she cleaned. One of the homes was owned by an older couple who had no kids but had a huge house and a really nice pool that they always invited me and my siblings to come swim in. The husband worked as the COO of a large airline company, and they lived in a really nice neighborhood with a large lot of forest of trees. When you were in their backyard, you couldn't see any other houses at all, just trees. It felt really secluded and almost spa-like, with a waterfall and a short iron fence, so you had a good view of it. The house was really angular and architecturally interesting, with multiple levels made from stone walls, even on the inside. Pretty much every room had huge floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the backyard and gave great views during the day. At night, however, the reflection from inside lights prevented you seeing out, so it was always a little unnerving to walk by them since you couldn't see what was outside. The couple also decorated with old Native American art and masks, which was a little creepy to a middle schooler. But the couple wasn't creepy in themselves, so I wasn't too scared. They had an older golden retriever called Samson that lived up to his name and was a massive but sweet dog with a gentle temperament. They also had recently rescued a husky mix called Sadie, who was quite the opposite. Psycho Sadie, as we lovingly called her, had intense separation and stranger anxiety, and would destroy the house if left alone inside, jump their short fence if left out, and if they took her with them to run errands, she'd destroy the car and howl non-stop until they returned. So since they were wealthy and had the extra money, they would pay for me or my sister come over and dog sit while they were out. We were getting paid $20 an hour, and we were always excited to go over there and just watch their cable and swim in their awesome pool. Normally everything would be fine and both dogs would just lay around, but occasionally Sadie would realize I was a stranger and go nuts and start barking at me. One time she backed me into a corner and wouldn't stop barking, and I watched her eyes literally turn red. I was convinced she was going to attack me, but she eventually calmed down. After I got up on a couch and showed her how big, or not, I was, but I digress. This particular incident happened over Easter weekend while the homeowners were out of town for 2 days. They were paying my sister to stay there over the weekend, and I stayed with her the first night because it was a big house and kind of scary to stay there all alone. So we stayed up late watching chick flicks and eating junk food. The next day we swam in their pool, hung out a bit, but for some reason I didn't spend the night again, and I'm so glad I didn't, because what happened that night scarred my sister for life. It all started when my sister was working out on their treadmill. Their workout room was on the bottom floor of the home, which was a walkout basement. Just outside the room was a huge sliding glass door that opened onto their patio and pool. She had the TV on in their workout room, watching the 10 Commandments, that is always on the night before Easter. As she was running, she thought she heard the house alarm beep, like it did whenever a door opened. She stopped the treadmill, and went to look around and saw the sliding glass door was open. Now this door is huge, and there is no way it could have just opened by itself, so she was instantly freaked. However, the dogs were just laying there in the workout room, and she figured they would have gotten up to investigate had someone come in, since those are the kind of instincts that the dogs have, especially Sadie, as she hated strangers. So she made excuses that she had accidentally left it open and simply must have imagined the beep of the alarm, and how it must have been either the TV or the treadmill. She closed and locked the door and went back to working out, but a few minutes later she had the distinct feeling of someone watching her. She looked around but didn't see anyone. She finished her workout but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so she decided to just go to bed because she was a little creeped out and wanted to forget about it. She went around and made sure all the doors were locked. The owners didn't give her the alarm code, so she couldn't set it, and she took a shower and locked herself in the guest room with both dogs just in case, and eventually they fell asleep. Some hours later she awoke to both dogs growling at the door of the room. Now it was fairly normal for Psycho Sadie to growl and bark at nothing, but Samson had never barked or showed any signs of aggression before, and immediately my sister knew something was up. She was shaking and trying to convince herself that the dogs had just heard an animal and that it was nothing. But then she heard that dreadful door alarm beep. She called my dad in a panic, crying and screaming, and he told her to hang up and call the police while he was on his way. She called the cops and my dad made the 15-minute drive in under 5, and when she opened the bedroom door to let my dad in the house, the dogs took off running and barking through the house and downstairs to the basement. My sister ran screaming all the way through the house to the front door to let my dad in, and he took a quick look around the upstairs levels with his gun but didn't see anything unusual. The police arrived a few minutes later and looked around and found that the back gate was open, as well as the sliding glass door again, but not enough to let the dogs out. Just barely, like it had been slammed shut and bounced back a little. They said it looked like someone had entered the home through the sliding glass door because the lock had been tampered with, but they were determined that whoever did it hadn't stolen or disturbed anything. When my dad asked why someone would break in and not do anything, especially with the dogs locked up, the police said that they had been notified by the homeowners earlier that month that the husband had received a death threat because of some decisions he made at his job that put a lot of people out of work. They had gone to the police about it, but didn't bother to tell my sister to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Thanks a lot for the heads up. Needless to say, we never dog sat for them again, and they moved out of state within a few months because he lost his job, and he deserved it. Worst spa ever. My sister's boyfriend's sister, yeah, you heard that right, lived in an apartment with a few of her other girlfriends. Some ball or late night party came around, but she decided to not go and ended up being home alone. She went to sleep but was awoken when she heard the front door unlock, accompanied by some footsteps. She thought it was just her friends coming back from the party, but kind of freaked out when the persons came into her room and started rummaging around in her drawers. Burglars. She peeked out, pretending to be asleep, not wanting to get into any trouble, and to just let them take some weird pervy stuff, like jewelry maybe, and stay safe. As they were about to leave, one of them, the only one, she wasn't sure how many people it was, crouched down next to her bed and said, "I know you're not sleeping, princess," and left the apartment. I was with my girlfriend at the time, chilling in the basement garage, listening to music, having drinks, and I go up to the kitchen, looking for my phone but can't find it. I had a few drinks, so I must have misplaced it somewhere. No biggie. I see my girlfriend's phone was charging, so I pick it up to check the time. Then I go down to the basement garage. Later on in the night, she goes up to the kitchen upstairs looking for her phone but can't seem to find it. We both go upstairs. We both had had a few drinks and ended up going to bed. Next morning I'm looking for my phone. She's looking for hers, but we can't find them. Weird, since I'd seen her phone the night before. Then I notice my watch isn't where I left it. She looks outside to the backyard and sees her purse and my work computer lying on the grass. It then hit us that someone had entered the house while we were downstairs in the basement garage, and not only that, they were hiding when I came up to get my phone, since I had to check hers, and it was missing the morning after. Guess it goes without saying that I changed all the locks, put motion detector lights in the backyard, and put a locked fence. One thing is to be robbed. Another thing is to be robbed when you're in the house. I took my dog out in my backyard on her leash late one night. I had turned off the motion sensor light several days before, so it was pitch black back there, and my eyes had not yet adjusted. As we walked past a bush, my dog started going nuts, growling and barking. I let her retractable leash out a bit, and all of a sudden I see movement in the leaves. Something very large slowly started crawling out towards me and getting up. At first I just thought it was a big dog, but it was too large. My heart started pounding in my chest as it continued getting up higher and higher, now to the height of a deer or larger animal. As my eyes were adjusting to the darkness, it appeared human-like. I had literally just finished watching an episode of True Blood with a guy who turns from a dog into a man, so I thought I was freaking out at this point. Once the creature is standing fully upright and stumbling forwards, he starts speaking. "Keep your dog back." At this point I realized it's a man who was hiding or passed out in my bushes. My adrenaline and fear are so strong I put my arm up to his face. He staggers and stumbles and puts his arms up to protect his head, all the while apologizing and trying to keep back from my dog. I demand to know what the hell he's doing in my yard, and he begins crawling around, telling me he lost his keys back there and was looking for them. I walk towards him to kick him, and he slowly stumbles out of the front of my house and down the street. I went inside to call the police and spent the rest of the night making sure he did not return. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I went on an impromptu road trip. We packed up the car and the dogs and drove up to the far northern California redwoods. I was somewhat familiar with the area from the time I was a kid, and it seemed very adventurous just heading out with a true destination in mind. A couple of nights in, we ended up meeting up a friend of a friend, grabbing some drinks, and she invited us to crash at her house for the night. We happily took her up on the offer, because it saved us from dropping money on a motel or trying to find a camping spot. She lived in a super cool looking old Victorian house. Our friend normally had 6 roommates, including several guys, but since it was summertime and most of them were students, it was only her and another female roommate plus us for the night. We drank some beers and hung out and then went to crash. Both roommates were upstairs, and my boyfriend and I, with our dogs, were crashing on a futon downstairs in a room that was right in the front of the house off the front door. It was kind of a sitting room with a fireplace and big bay windows looking out to the front yard, which had a good cover of bushes. We both fell asleep easily, and were in deep sleep until we were suddenly awoken by the doorbell ringing. Now this is an old Victorian house, so it has an old school, deep ringing doorbell that you hear throughout the house. One of the residents of the house came down and opened the door and looked out to see nothing, so she went back upstairs to bed. My boyfriend and I thought it was kind of weird, but not our house. Maybe late night visitors were common. We fell back asleep and were then awoken again sometime later by the doorbell. We heard the roommate come down again and look outside the door and shut it. This time, she walked into the room after and asked if we heard the doorbell, and we could tell she'd been weirded out. We told her not to open the door if it happened again, and all came to the conclusion it must be the doorbell malfunctioning. The roommate goes back upstairs and we fall asleep. Next, I wake up to one of my dogs growling the most deep-throated growl I've ever heard. He absolutely loves people, even if they're strangers, and we live in downtown of a pretty major city, so having him growl at something at night is not normal. We chalk it up to being in an unfamiliar house and tell him to be quiet. I fell asleep again. Next thing I know, I wake up to my boyfriend jumping out of bed and literally smacking the big bay window about 5 feet away from our bed and yelling. There's a man's face standing in the window staring at us. My boyfriend immediately grabbed an axe, as we'd been camping and it was right at hand, and chased the guy down the street. I'm pretty sure that creep must have crapped his pants. The whole commotion woke up everything, and we stayed up for the rest of the night keeping guard. The scariest thing to me is that the guy was probably casing the house and wanted to rob it. There's no reason for him to ring the doorbell multiple times. He wanted to see if it was only the girl's home, depending on who came to the door, and it gives me chills just thinking about it. A few years ago, my husband worked night shift. He typically got home around 6 a.m. and worked a 45-minute drive away. One night I decided to let my 2 kids watch a movie in my bed on the laptop. It was already fairly late, around 10 p.m, so I figured they'd fall asleep and they could just stay in my bed that night. I locked up the whole house. Everyone got ready for bed and we started the movie. About 40 minutes into it, I heard someone walk through the dining room. My room is directly off the dining room, and it has hardwood flooring, so it's pretty easy to hear footsteps. I leave the dining room light on for my husband, so I had my door closed almost all the way, save for an inch to block the light. I figured he'd come home early, and continued watching the movie. After 5 minutes of hearing someone walk back and forth across the dining room, and he hadn't come in, I decided to find out what's up, paused the movie, and told the kids to stay put and open the door. The footsteps immediately stopped, and no one was there. I looked all over the house, checking every window, closet, and outside door. Everything was still locked, and nothing was out of place. Then I heard a meow and laughed at myself for freaking out over a cat, until I walked into the kitchen to feed him, and he was sitting outside on the back porch. The door was still locked. Then my husband called from work 45 minutes away. He said to make sure I locked up because a neighbor had their house broken into a few streets over earlier that day. I lost it and started crying. I was terrified. I grew up in a fairly big home. 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 2 stories, and a guest house, all on about 5 acres. It was my parents, my 2 sisters, who both had babies at the time, my aunt and uncle and my grandma living with us. Everyone started moving out and finding their own place, so by the time this happened it was just me and my parents. My parents go out for the night, and I go to a friend's house. I get home around 7:30, and I know my parents don't plan on being home for at least a few more hours. I get home to the porch light and front hall light being turned on. As soon as you walk through the door, you could go straight into the living room, left to the bedrooms, or right to the kitchen. I decide to go right into the kitchen and make some dinner for myself. Then went into the living room to settle into some TV for a while. It's around 10ish, and I decide it's bedtime. So I shut off everything except a few lights so that my parents can see when they arrive home, and head upstairs to bed. There were 5 bedrooms downstairs and 2 upstairs, one of them being mine. It had a huge closet, bigger than most people's bathrooms, and it had its own bathroom, so plenty of places to hide in there. All the lights were turned off. I flicked on the lights to the stairwell, then walked up the stairs. I turned on the light between the bedrooms, which weren't very bright. Picture the glow of maybe one of those tap lights, and opened the door, as both were closed. The second room used to be my grandma's, but became a game room of sorts. Now my room was an odd setup. The closet door was right of where you walked in and had a separate light switch. Then the room itself had 1 light, and then the vanity on the wall had about 8 lights with all separate switches. So I flicked on the main light for the room, which usually wasn't enough to light up the whole room, but enough to let me get changed and go to bed, as my bed is directly under the switch. And suddenly, there he is. This kid sitting on my bed in complete darkness. He didn't say anything to me for a solid 30 seconds before I screamed and ran down the stairs. Then he ran home. I wish I could say that's the last experience I had with him, but there were more. As time passed, he'd come over to ring the doorbell and see if I were home, and would then just leave. He stole a lot of stuff from our house, mostly food, once my bike, a video game, some cash. I honestly have no idea where he's at now, though. I moved out of that house years ago. He, as far as I learned, grew up in a poor family. His dad was in jail, his mum abandoned him with his elderly grandmother who didn't work, and they lived in the next house over, which was about 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom between his grandmother himself, his sister, and the 3 cousins. The last I heard, he'd gotten arrested a few times for stealing from store shelves, and to keep him out of trouble, they sent him to live in Washington with his aunt, who could keep a better eye on him. When I was 10 years old, my parents bought a condemned house to be renovated by us. This would be a year-long process. When it came time to sign papers for the house, the former owner nonchalantly mentions that her brother, that has been in prison for 10 years, is about to get out of prison. His name is Jimmy. She said he had somewhat of a split personality. One moment he was an angel, and the next he had a shotgun pointed at your face. We did not know what to expect, and as a little boy I was a little nervous about it. And we were locked in the contract as we'd already signed the papers. Months had gone by, and we had been working at the house when all of a sudden one day we find that the driveway was barricaded and someone had crapped on our front porch. It was Jimmy. He had pulled all of our construction equipment in the driveway to block us and then pinched a loaf on our porch. We called the cops, had a restraining order put on him, and didn't see him for a while. Now, why was he in prison? He and a friend got drunk one night. His friend stated that he wanted to kill himself, and Jimmy said he would do it for him. So Jimmy found a stick and stabbed his friend and killed him. But it didn't end there. Jimmy poured wax over his friend's eyes, cut him into several pieces, and spread the body parts all over town we lived in. He also killed someone out of self-defense in prison. We had finished renovating our house and we all moved in. Jimmy hadn't shown up for a while, which is what creeped me out. I shared a room with my brothers. This room was near the front porch. My mind played with me for a solid year, and I barely slept because I thought Jimmy was outside my window just waiting to pour wax all over my eyes. A few more months go by, and Jimmy showed up one day. He wanted to come in and apologize for us for what he did to the house. My siblings and I are standing at the door watching my dad outside talking to him. My dad said no, of course, and told him to leave. That was the last time we ever saw Jimmy. Though he never really did anything to hurt us. The thought is what scared me for the longest time. I was staying over one night at a friend's house back when I was in junior high. We heard some noise coming from behind the equipment shed and thought someone may be trying to steal tools. I grabbed a baseball bat and a flashlight while he picked up a hockey stick. We decided it would be best to sneak up on whoever was back there. As we rounded the corner, I aimed the flashlight at the presumed thief. To our surprise, 2 glowing eyes stared back at us. After a few terrified moments, it dawned on me that I was staring into the face of a mountain lion, one that was standing less than 10 feet away. I kept the flashlight trained on the mountain lion as we slowly backed around the corner again. We then ran like hell back into the house and sat down shaking for several minutes. The messed up thing is that I live in Vermont. They're supposed to be extinct up here. This was 22 years ago. Maybe some still survived back then. Moral of the story: don't bring a baseball bat to a mountain lion fight. One night when I was 11 years old, I was watching TV with my 2 older sisters of 13 and 15. Our parents were out later to party, but being home alone was nothing new to us. Just before 1 a.m. our dog stood up and left the family room and began to stare out the back door of the kitchen, just off the family room. A minute later he went absolutely crazy. It was not the typical barking sound or the growling of a stranger or cat. It was an insane mixture of incredibly loud barking and wild animal growling, the sound one would make in a truly life or death situation. This, of course, freaked the hell out of us. We went to our dog to comfort him, and after 20 seconds of discussion of what the hell was going on, we decided we had better secure the house as quickly as possible. It was a large house with many doors and windows to check. We all ran frantically to lock up everything as quickly as possible. The last door I got to was the garage door. A split second after locking it, I put my hand around the handle to verify it was locked, and felt someone on the other side viciously shaking the handle, pushing, trying to open the door. We of course made quite a few phone calls within the next few minutes. The memory of the feeling of the violent shaking, knowing the person my dog freaked out about, was 1 foot from me, on the other side, creeps the hell out of me even now. I was 14, and my family had moved to a big and kind of run-down farmhouse that was kind of creepy but cheap to rent. The closest neighbors were pretty far away, and a cornfield surrounded most of our property. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to the light in the hallway going on. I'm a really light sleeper, and a few minutes later my dog starts whining outside my door and scratching to be let in. I get up and let him in, and he crawls under my bed to sleep. He does this sometimes, but had never woken me up to be let in before. I was a little weirded out but also pretty tired, so fell back asleep without much thought. I wake up again a little while later to my bedroom door creaking. I see fingers wrapped around the side of the door as it is slowly being pushed open. In a half-asleep kind of stupor, I ask who it is, and a man clearly trying to imitate a woman assures me that it's just my mother, checking in on you. I keep saying, no, you're not. You don't sound like my mother. And he keeps assuring me that he is. I'm obviously not fully awake yet, or I would have noticed how creepy the exchange was. Suddenly the door starts being pushed even further open, and the hand pushes through the door followed by an arm, and I realize this person is coming into my bedroom. I start freaking out and screaming when I realize what's happening. My dog jumps out from under the bed and lunges at the door, causing the person to shut it quickly, and not allowing me to see his or her face or anything. By this time, my mum has woken up from my screaming and starts yelling at me if I'm okay. She comes down the hall to my room and says that she saw a big figure with stockings on his head standing outside my door. My mum started screaming too, and the person ran down the back staircase of our house, which had a door and simply looked like a closet, so they had prior knowledge of its existence, and then they ran out the back door into the cornfield. Nothing in my house was stolen, and there was no evidence that the person that had broken in wanted anything other than to come into my room. I don't think I've been the same since it happened, and I feel incredibly anxious even thinking about it. Many years ago, when I was about 21, I was staying at my parents' place after finishing university and figuring out what to do with my life. During those halcyon days, I often went out in the evenings to party and would come back at unearthly hours, and upon return would creep in as quietly as possible, as my parents were very light sleepers. One fine midnight hour, I did just this, having arrived at the house under the swell of a crescent moon, carefully tiptoeing up the gravel drive, gently turning the key in the lock, padding my way to the spare bedroom and tenderly pushing the door shut. Somewhat pissed, and continuing to remain in the spirit of night camouflage, I kept the light off and stood behind the door and slowly started to getting dressed. Having pulled off my top, I suddenly became aware in the gloom that the door behind me seemed to be opening on its own. Remaining calm, I stopped undressing and found myself naturally moving back behind the door as it opened mysteriously into the room. Assuming it was my mum or dad, as there was no one else in the house, and being admittedly still quite pissed as I opened the door, I dutifully craned my neck and uttered, in a slightly theatrical but friendly voice, "Hello?" From that point on, all hell broke loose. For all I could hear in the darkness following my greeting was screaming and shrieking at a high decibel, and the sound of crashing madness in the hallway. I quickly turned on the bedroom light and sprang into the hallway only to be met by more screams, screams of horror, terror, and sheer, unmitigated madness. As I looked down the hallway, I saw my mother stark naked, a somewhat rotund woman, facing me transfixed with fear on her face, falling backwards onto the enormous cupboards along the hallway as she flailed her arms in terror and only screaming louder upon my apparent presence. Her madness combined with her short-sightedness was clearly such that she could no longer recognize me, and I had, in her mind, become some kind of nightmarish intruder who, despite a friendly hello at 1 a.m. in the morning, coming from her son's bedroom, was not enough to trigger some much-needed familiarity. It was so strange. For a good 15 seconds I stood there saying, "Mum, it's me," only to have her go into another thunderous bout of terror and screaming. All the commotion obviously woke up my dad, and the scene ended with him emerging from the master bedroom, bleary-eyed and bewildered with a dressing gown on, naked wife hyperventilating against the closet door, and a confused drunken son in boxer shorts looking at him with a sense of desperation and resolute hilarity. Scary for Mum, surreal for me. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you did, you can let me know in the usual way. I do post 4 times a week, so subscribe if you're new and haven't done so already. That's pretty cool. Yeah, break-ins are pretty terrifying. Also, have you guys, I don't know, I've been posting this on my Insta story and my YouTube story. Have you guys seen all these werewolf reports bouncing around? It's really random. If you see anything, let me know. I'm really interested in what's going on right now. It's fun to see like a cryptid being spoken about by more than just like the regular community, right? Anyway, a huge thank you as always to my members, patrons, and coffee supporters. You guys are amazing. And if you'd like to receive some cool perks for supporting me, that's, you can do that, and you can find them by following the links in the description. Alright then guys, I think I'm going to sign everything off from here. Stay awesome. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.